the Russian casualty rate across the entire theater is not sustainable. We've talked about this for a long time, but all the open source intelligence indicates that the Russians lose between, on average, 30,000 troops per month, killed and wounded. In the quarter four of 2024, the Russians pushed harder because I think they're sprinting at the end of a marathon, and they were losing closer to 40 or 45 casualties per month. So when North Korea gifted the Russians 10,000 soldiers back in the fall, that was really just roughly 10 days worth of soldiers if you were to aggregate it across the entirety of the theater. Now, within Kursk itself specifically, we've not been able to confirm independently the number of North Koreans killed or wounded because we actually we're not prepared to look at people's faces and pictures and say, yep, those are North Koreans versus Asiatic Russians living, coming from eastern Siberian parts of Russia. However, that's all consistent with the reports that we've gotten from Pentagon officials and UK officials and Ukrainian officials. I think it was just about a couple weeks ago, the Pentagon claimed that the Russians have taken on about 1,000 casualties, a battalion being between 500 and 1,000 in total, which was over the course of several weeks of fighting. And then that was before that the Russians even started to decisively deploy North Koreans in these wave attacks. The purported combat footage that we've seen of the North Koreans being used shows them being used as dismounted infantry without vehicle support, being marched across fields to go seize tactical land. And the Ukrainians engaging them relatively effectively because that is not a particularly effective use of infantry. But you make gains that way, but it comes at a tremendous human cost. And the frontline villages where the North Koreans are reportedly fighting, where, according to Russian reports, they are indeed frontline towns, and they are indeed the places where the Ukrainians are attacking in some areas new as well. So it's not inconceivable that you would see up to a battalion's worth of casualties over a 48-hour period. That actually occurs in other parts of the theater too. Just yesterday, there was a Ukrainian brigade commander in the Pokrovsk area in southeastern Ukraine who reported that about a battalion's worth of Russians are killed and wounded per day there as well, about 400 guys a day. So the hotspots are really hot.
I mean, there has been speculation for so long as to whether Putin will be forced to launch a fresh wave of mobilization to try and address the casualty rate. How do you rate the chances of that happening at some point in the coming months, George?
I think if we can hold the Russians to the current tempo of operations, where they continue to lose between 20 to 30K guys a month, it's a question of time. When will Putin have to call mobilization? Because really starting since the fall, we've seen the system for Russian force generation, the system by which they generate volunteers by using insane financial incentives, economic incentives. It's become less effective. The system's not working as well as it used to. You can plot the XY graph for how much the various Russian regions are now offering for these one-time enlistment bonuses and so on and so forth. I mean, just yesterday, the oblast in, I believe it was Samara, they broke the record with a now 4 million ruble one-time signing bonus. That's about $36,000 USD. The average Russian annual salary is 1.2 million rubles. So you can basically make 4 times the annual salary in Russia just by in a one-time sign-up bonus, which is absurd. And of course, this is breaking the Russian economy in real time. Inflation is a major deal within Russia. The overnight insurance rate is, I have to double check. Last I checked, this is before the Russian central bank met in late December, but it was 21%. They were reportedly going to raise it to 23%. Russia's burning through its sovereign wealth fund, right? Everyone's flush with this Ministry of Defense cash. But that's just causing a whole lot of inflation. And it's not sustainable from the Russian economic perspective. Neither is it sustainable from the Russian force generation perspective, because it feeds into an existing Russian labor deficit. They have over 1 million vacancies in the workplace due to tremendous number of people going to go fight and die. And so I really do see it as a question of time. Putin wants to stave off for as long as possible the requirement to have to do mobilization. And I think that's part of the reason why the Kremlin is actually doing this sticks and carrots, charm and coercion offensive now with the Oreshnik ballistic missile strikes, and while also simultaneously trying to go into negotiations, because Putin would love to off-ramp himself from the current collision course that he has with difficult decisions and accumulated risk coming down the pike in the next several months. But look, provided that the current tempo of operations keeps going, I think Putin will have to call mobilization within the next 18 to 24 months. I don't know exactly when.
It's such a good point you raised, George, about the state of the economy as well. It's almost like Putin is in a kind of vicious circle of unsustainability. He's got two things that are unsustainable: the casualty rates on the front line, but he can only get out of that by essentially bribing, as you describe, ordinary Russians to sign up. But that comes at huge economic expense that makes the Russian economy unsustainable. So, whichever way he turns, he's got a different form of unsustainability.
Precisely. And look, even to end the war, if he ended it today and the casualty rate dropped to zero overnight, that would also impose problems on him as well, because now he has to deal with several 100,000 violent men coming back into Russian society, where there are not going to be sufficient jobs and opportunities to employ them. And so how do you deal with the externalities of all these violent men then returning to domestic, civilian life? Because that'll definitely cause problems too. And of course, the Russian defense sector is employing so many people too. And so if you were to decrease the requirements of the defense sector employment, that will cause other structural unemployment as well. So really, yeah, it's damned if you do, damned if you don't, in many sort of ways. And I hope that the Western leaders, as we continue to think about conflict termination and negotiations, we realize actually there's a lot of leverage that the Russians have allowed themselves to give to us, and we should exploit that leverage and seek concessions from the Russians, as opposed to delivering unto the Russians pre-concessions before just to get to the table with.
And just finally, George, here we are having this conversation right at the beginning of 2025. If you put yourself in Vladimir Putin's shoes, what is the one thing you are most worried about happening over the next 12 months, either on the battlefield or off it?
I think the most worrying thing that I'm concerned about is, what does the upcoming Trump administration decide to do vis-a-vis Ukraine? Will Trump take the bait, and will Trump essentially do what Putin and what Lavrov and the Russian Foreign Ministry have been asking, which is pre-concessions just to get to the negotiating table on Ukraine's sovereignty and right to association? They want Ukraine to not join NATO and the EU. Of course, it is a sovereign state's right to be allowed to freely associate. And so I think Putin would love it if he could get an off-ramp to this war, get not a deal where both sides negotiate and both sides take some concessions, but the version in which the Russians get everything they want but sacrifice nothing. That'd be very good. But of course, the dangerous thing is that the new Trump administration, they go into this very clear-eyed with strategic sense about American interests, and they realize actually that there's a deal to be made here, but it's a deal that involves really serious Russian concessions. And that if we actually just continue what we're doing, that is sustaining the Ukrainian fight, maintaining its high tempo of operations, which is burning and destroying Russia's combat power and economy, that come hell or high water, within the next 12 months, there's going to be difficult economic, demographic, military readiness problems that are going to only further mature for Russia. So I think Putin's put all of his eggs into the basket of what is Washington going to do, and I think he's very, very concerned about what American policy towards Ukraine is going to look like, coming into the next month or two.
Thank you for watching today's episode of Frontline. For early access to our videos, member-only Q&As and live streams, then sign up for a membership via the link in the description. And for the latest news and breaking stories, listen to Times Radio and follow us at thetimes.com.